Let's get started. Story number 1.
I moved to the small town of Ashford just a few months ago. It wasn't my first choice, but life had a way of leading me to places I never planned to go. The town was quiet, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night, and the biggest event of the year was the annual harvest fair. Yet there was one thing that made Ashford stand out: the old mill on the edge of town. The building had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The locals called it the Hollow, and everyone knew to steer clear of it. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, who hadn't seen old, run-down buildings that had long since been left behind by time? But the mill had an air about it, a feeling that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you drove by. It was isolated, surrounded by thick trees, with a tall stone wall that had long ago begun to crumble away. From a distance, it looked as though nature was slowly swallowing it whole. I first heard the rumors about the mill when I went to the local bar one evening to grab a drink and meet some of the locals. The bartender, a woman in her late 40s named Ellie, was talking to a regular named Jim when I overheard them mention it. They were both in hushed tones, as if talking about something that was better left unsaid. I leaned in a little, curious, and caught snippets of their conversation. Don't go there at night. Strange things happen. Nobody who's gone in has come back the same. Jim said, his voice low and wary. Ellie sighed. It's not just stories, Jim. People don't just make things like that up. There's a reason nobody goes near that place. That caught my attention. I had to ask, what's so bad about the mill? I couldn't help but ask. Both of them turned to look at me. Jim gave me a strange look, but Ellie's expression softened, almost as if she had been expecting this question. It's not the kind of place you want to know about, she said slowly, wiping a glass with a rag. They say there's something in that building. Something. Not right. At the time, I laughed it off. It seemed like the kind of thing that people in small towns talked about when they were bored. But the more I heard about the mill, the more it piqued my interest. The next few weeks, I couldn't get the place out of my mind. One rainy evening, when I had nothing else to do, I decided to take a walk over to the mill. It was a small, impulsive decision, the kind of thing you do when you feel like you need to prove something to yourself. I figured I could check it out, maybe snap a few pictures, and get some peace of mind about the stories. It was a little past dusk, and the rain was light but steady, the kind of mist that seemed to hang in the air more than fall. The mill sat on a patch of land on the outskirts of town, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. The stone wall that surrounded it had crumbled in several places, and the iron gate that had once kept people out was now hanging on by a single rusted hinge. I walked through the gap in the gate and made my way toward the building, the crunch of wet leaves underfoot the only sound that accompanied me. The closer I got, the more unsettling the place became. The windows of the mill were covered in grime, and the large double doors at the entrance were shut, though they looked as though they hadn't been properly closed in years. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the silence around me, but curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out to push the door open. It creaked loudly, echoing into the dark interior of the building. I stepped inside, the door groaning as it swung open, and the smell of decay hit me immediately. It was musty, damp, like the air hadn't been disturbed in decades. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the dark, revealing rows of decaying machinery and old, rotting wooden beams. The place was a maze of rusted gears, broken windows, and piles of debris. As I walked deeper into the building, I noticed how cold it had become, a chill that wasn't just from the rain outside. I shone the light around, noticing strange marks on the walls, scratches like someone had clawed at them. The more I looked, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something unsettling about the way the shadows clung to the walls, as though the darkness had its own life. My breath quickened, and I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, there was no reason to be afraid. It was just an abandoned building. But then I heard it. A faint, scraping noise. At first, I thought it was the sound of rats, or maybe the wind pushing something along the floor. But it was rhythmic, like the dragging of something or someone moving through the mill. The noise was slow, deliberate. I froze in place, my pulse hammering in my ears. It stopped. I waited, every nerve in my body on high alert. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jerky shadows on the walls. The silence that followed felt oppressive. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. I should have left then, but instead, I took a step forward, drawn by a strange compulsion. I moved deeper into the building, the scraping noise now louder, as if whatever was making it was getting closer. The beam of my flashlight landed on something moving in the darkness. It was a figure. A person, or something that resembled a person. They were hunched over, dragging themselves across the floor. Their clothes were torn, and their face was hidden in the shadows. The figure stopped moving, its head turning toward me. My heart lurched in my chest as I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. Then it spoke. A voice, raspy and low, came from the figure. "Get out!" The words sent a jolt of terror through my body. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, but I didn't dare bend to pick it up. My feet were stuck in place, my whole body paralyzed by the sight of that thing in front of me. The figure began to slowly rise, its movement jerky and unnatural. It was a man, or at least it used to be. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, as though he hadn't seen the light of day in years. He took a step toward me, dragging one leg behind him. His hand reached out, as though trying to grab me. I didn't think, I just ran. I didn't look back as I sprinted through the mill, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears louder than my footsteps. The door slammed behind me as I burst outside, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my hands trembling as I started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back at the mill. The next day, I went back to the bar, still shaken by what I had seen. Ellie was behind the counter, wiping glasses as usual. I hesitated for a moment before asking, "Ellie, what happened at the mill? Why does everyone stay away from it?" Ellie looked at me, her expression serious. "It's not just the place, kid. It's what happened there. Those who worked in the mill, many of them died in strange accidents. Some say their spirits still haunt it. Some say that whatever is in there now, it's not just the dead, but something that's waiting, something that wants to drag you in. I don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I ever want to. But one thing is certain, I'll never go back to the mill." Story the end.
Story number 2.
The old mill had been abandoned for decades. It sat at the edge of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and vines that slowly reclaimed the land. I had driven by it countless times, its crumbling structure always piquing my curiosity. The locals always told stories about the place, stories of strange sounds coming from inside at night, of lights flickering in the upper windows when no one had been inside for years. It was a place that most people stayed far away from, but for some reason I found myself intrigued. I had to see it for myself. I was new to town, having moved here for a fresh start. The small, quiet town was charming, but there was an unsettling history that I couldn't ignore. I had heard about the mill's dark past, the tragic accident that had claimed the lives of 3 workers over a century ago. The mill was never quite the same after that, or so the stories went. They said the place was haunted, cursed by the souls of those who died there. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but still, something about it tugged at me. One evening, after finishing up a long day of work, I decided to check it out. It was just past dusk, and the air had a crisp chill to it. I drove my car down the narrow road leading to the mill, the headlights cutting through the thickening fog. As I approached the entrance, I could see the silhouette of the building in the distance, just towering above the trees like a forgotten giant. I parked my car by the old iron gate, which was rusted and barely hanging on its hinges. The moment I stepped out, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. The woods around me were eerily quiet, not even the sound of crickets or rustling leaves. Just a suffocating silence. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation of the place. The building itself was even more imposing up close. The windows were boarded up, and the once sturdy brick walls were crumbling with age. The front door, made of thick wood, was slightly ajar. It creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sharp in the stillness. Inside, the air was damp and stale. Dust hung in the air, and the floor was covered in debris. The walls were cracked, and chunks of plaster had fallen away, revealing the old wooden beams beneath. I took a few tentative steps into the mill, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the emptiness. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed forward, eager to explore. The inside was a labyrinth of decaying machinery, rusted gears, and rotting wood. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as though no one had set foot in the place for years. The remnants of the mill's former life were scattered everywhere, a haunting reminder of the work that once took place here. I wandered deeper into the building, my flashlight flickering as I moved. The further I went, the more the air seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping inexplicably. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself, trying to ignore the chill creeping into my bones. I entered a large room that looked like it had once been the heart of the mill, with high ceilings and old machinery scattered throughout. The beam of my flashlight caught something strange in the corner, an old, rusted ladder leading up to a narrow loft area. Without thinking, I started to climb. My heart was racing, the excitement of the adventure overpowering the unease gnawing at me. As I reached the top and stepped onto the loft, I felt a sudden pressure in the air as though something was watching me. My flashlight trembled in my hand, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A figure, standing near the far end of the loft. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't. The figure was tall, dressed in ragged clothes, its face hidden in shadow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I opened my mouth to call out, but no words came. For a moment, the figure stood still, as though waiting for something. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked toward the far wall. I watched in disbelief as it disappeared behind a pile of old crates. I was too terrified to move, my mind racing with questions. Had I really seen something? Or was it just my imagination? I stood there, paralyzed, until the sound of something scraping against the floor broke the silence. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from the direction where the figure had disappeared. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way toward the noise, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The closer I got, the louder the sound became. It was the unmistakable noise of something. Someone dragging itself across the floor. I reached the pile of crates and hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. The scraping sound was now accompanied by soft, raspy breathing, as though the person, or whatever it was struggling to move. I felt the overwhelming urge to turn around and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. My flashlight shone on the crates, but there was nothing there. Then the noise stopped. For a long moment there was only silence, thick and suffocating. I stood there, straining my ears, waiting for something, anything to happen. Just as I was about to turn away, the air grew colder, and I felt a sudden rush of wind, though there were no open windows. My flashlight flickered and then went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to turn it back on. My breath came in short, ragged gad gasps. I heard something, a soft shuffle like bare feet dragging across the floor. It was closer now, much closer. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing. Then I felt it. A cold hand, cold as death, wrap around my wrist. I screamed, jerking away, but the grip tightened. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, and I could feel the presence of something right behind me, its breath cold against my neck. I struggled to break free, but the hand wouldn't let go. I twisted and turned, desperate to escape, when finally the grip loosened. The coldness vanished, and the room went still. I didn't hesitate. I bolted down the ladder, ran through the dark hallways, and out the front door. I didn't look back, not even once. My car was parked at the gate, and I jumped in, slamming the door shut behind me. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the road, not stopping until I was safely back in town. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, questioning whether what I had seen was real. But the lingering feeling of that cold hand on my wrist, the suffocating presence that had surrounded me, told me that it was no mere figment of my imagination. I haven't been back to the mill. The building still stands, its crumbling structure looming over the town. But I know better now. Some things are best left undisturbed. Some places are haunted, not just by the dead, but by the things that lurk in the darkness, waiting for someone foolish enough to walk into their grasp. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The old hospital on the edge of town had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. It sat like a decaying monument to a forgotten time, its windows broken and covered in grime, its walls sagging from years of neglect. No one had set foot inside for as long as anyone could remember. The building had been condemned after a string of unexplained disappearances and strange events surrounding the final years of its operation. But in the dark corners of the town, people still whispered about the ghost stories and the eerie events that had plagued the hospital even after it closed its doors. I had grown up hearing the stories, and I had always brushed them off as nothing more than urban legends. But when my friends and I found ourselves bored one summer night with nothing to do and a need for adventure, the hospital came up in conversation. We dared each other to go inside. Everyone was nervous, but the challenge hung in the air like a dare we couldn't refuse. We parked a few blocks away from the hospital, trying to be discreet as we walked down the street toward the looming structure. The moon was barely visible through the thick clouds, casting everything in an eerie light. The air was still and cool, and as we neared the hospital, I could feel a chill creeping down my spine. I had always felt an unnatural pull toward the place, even though I had never been inside. Tonight, that pull was stronger than ever. The front gate was rusted, barely hanging on its hinges, but it still creaked open with a slight push. We stepped through cautiously, one by one, and made our way toward the front door. It was a heavy wooden thing, cracked and warped by years of exposure, but it still stood. As we pushed it open, the groan of the door seemed to echo through the emptiness. The scent of mildew and decay immediately hit us, stale air and the smell of long-forgotten things. The hallway inside was dark, the only light coming from the flashlights we had brought along. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and some of the doors along the hallway were wide open, revealing rooms filled with rubble, broken furniture, and the remnants of a time long past. As we ventured deeper into the building, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Every step we took felt like it was pushing us further into something we didn't fully understand. At first, it was just a thrill, exploring an old building, searching for signs of the past. But the further we went, the more it felt like we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the shadows, waiting for us. We reached the old operating room on the second floor. The door was slightly ajar, and as we pushed it open, a cold draft hit us, making us shiver. The room was large, its walls lined with broken surgical tools and rusted equipment. The floor was littered with glass shards, broken light fixtures, and pieces of old furniture. The only thing that stood out was a large, faded mural on the wall. What had once been a beautiful painting of a peaceful landscape, now just a blur of faded colors and peeling paint. "Let's split up," one of my friends suggested, eager to explore more of the building. We all agreed, though I didn't feel entirely comfortable with the idea. Still, I watched as my friends went in different directions, their flashlights flicking in and out of sight. I decided to explore a small hallway off to the side, which seemed to lead toward the back of the building. The further I walked, the more oppressive the silence became. It was strange. Every noise I made, every creak of the floor, felt like it was amplified, as though the building was absorbing all the sound. And yet, there was something else, a faint sound like footsteps echoing faintly in the distance. My heart began to race. I turned a corner and found myself in what had once been a patient ward. The room was empty now, save for old, rusted beds, their metal frames twisted and bent. The windows were shattered, the glass long gone, and the cold wind blew in, sending a chill down my spine. The room felt wrong. I couldn't explain why, but I could feel it in my gut. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, near a broken window, was a figure. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, but then I realized it wasn't. The figure stood still, staring into the darkness, its back to me. It was tall, its shape hazy, like it was made of shadow rather than flesh. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is that you?" The figure didn't move. I stepped forward, the air growing colder with each step. I tried to convince myself it was just one of my friends playing a prank, but something in my gut told me that wasn't the case. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. As I directed the light toward the figure, it suddenly turned, abruptly, unnaturally fast, and looked directly at me. The face that stared back was pale, almost gray, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Its mouth hung open in a grotesque way, like it was trying to speak, but couldn't. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the empty room and the distant sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I turned and ran, not caring that I was leaving my friends behind. I didn't look back as I sprinted down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I heard footsteps behind me again, but this time they were closer, too close. I could feel the cold air closing in, wrapping around me as I fled. I found my friends near the entrance, huddled together in the dark. Their faces were pale, and their eyes wide with fear. They had heard the footsteps too. We didn't speak as we rushed out of the building, our feet pounding on the cracked pavement as we made our way to the street. We didn't stop until we were safely back at my car, locked inside with the engine running. We didn't need to say anything to know that none of us wanted to go back. That night, none of us slept. We couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that the building hadn't let us leave without leaving its mark. We all went home the next morning, too shaken to talk much about it, but the strange events that had happened lingered in our minds. The figure, the footsteps, the overwhelming presence. We couldn't explain it. We didn't want to. A few days later, I heard that the old hospital was being demolished. The town had decided it was time to finally tear it down, to erase it from the landscape completely. I didn't feel sad about it. If anything, I felt relieved. I've never gone back to that hospital, and I don't think I ever will. There are some places that are better left untouched, and some things that shouldn't be disturbed. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
The abandoned building on the outskirts of town was a place most people avoided. It was an old office complex, gutted by a fire 20 years ago. The charred walls and broken windows made it a haunting sight during the day, but at night it seemed alive, as though the darkness inside was watching. Ben had always been drawn to places like that. A self-proclaimed urban explorer, he found beauty in the decay of forgotten spaces. He'd been to derelict hospitals, shuttered schools, and empty factories, always with his camera in hand. When he heard about the building, known locally as Hollow Ridge Office Park, he couldn't resist. The stories surrounding Hollow Ridge were typical of abandoned places. People claimed to hear footsteps in empty hallways, see figures in windows, and feel an oppressive presence. But what really intrigued Ben were the rumors of the fire. Officially, the blaze was ruled accidental, but whispers in town hinted at something more sinister. Some said the fire had been started intentionally to cover up a crime. Others claimed it wasn't a fire at all, that something unnatural had consumed the building from within. Ben arrived just before sunset. The air around the building was eerily still, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. He parked his car a short distance away and grabbed his gear, a flashlight, his camera, and a small crowbar in case he needed to pry open a door or window. The front entrance was boarded up, but a side door hung open, the rusted hinges barely holding it in place. As Ben stepped inside, the smell of soot and mildew hit him like a wall. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing long hallways filled with debris, shattered glass, broken furniture, and fragments of ceiling tiles. The first floor was uneventful. He found a few interesting spots for photos. An old reception desk with a nameplate still sitting on top, its letters blackened by fire, a conference room where a projector screen dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though moved by an invisible hand. But it was the second floor that felt wrong. The moment Ben stepped onto the landing, the temperature dropped noticeably. His breath puffed out in the cold air, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The hallway stretched before him, lined with offices, their doors ajar. He told himself it was just an old building, its structure failing and drafts sneaking through the cracks. But then he heard it, a faint scraping sound like nails on metal coming from one of the rooms ahead. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing down the corridor. No response. Ben tightened his grip on the flashlight and moved forward, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until he reached the doorway of an office at the end of the hall. Inside, the room was mostly empty, save for an overturned filing cabinet and a desk with one leg missing. The scraping noise had stopped, but Ben's eyes were drawn to something else. On the far wall, where the fire had blackened the paint, were scratch marks, deep gouges in the shape of 4 long fingers. Ben raised his camera, snapping a photo. As the flash illuminated the room, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye, a shadow that wasn't his own. He swung the flashlight around, but the room was empty. His heart raced, and for the first time, he considered leaving. But curiosity won out. The 3rd floor was worse. The walls were nearly caved in, and the floor sagged under his weight. Every step felt like a gamble, the boards groaning beneath him. And then there was the smell, an acrid, metallic odor that stung his nostrils and made his stomach turn. He entered what looked like a break room. The remains of a table and a few chairs sat in the center, and a refrigerator lay on its side, its door hanging open. Ben scanned the room with his flashlight, then froze. On the far wall was a phrase scrawled in blackened soot. "They never left." Ben's hand shook as he lifted the camera. He snapped a photo and immediately regretted it. The flash illuminated the room, and for a split second he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. They stood along the walls, their bodies charred and twisted, faces featureless except for hollow, empty sockets where eyes should have been. Ben stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. When the light steadied, the room was empty again. His breath came in short gasps as he turned and bolted for the stairs. But the building wasn't done with him. As he reached the 2nd floor landing, he heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from above. He glanced up and saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was tall and thin, its body blackened like the walls with long arms that ended in clawed hands, its head tilted unnaturally to the side as though it were studying him. Ben didn't wait to see what it would do. He sprinted down the stairs, his boots slipping on the debris. The footsteps above him quickened, matching his pace. He didn't dare look back. The 1st floor seemed endless, the hallway stretching on forever. He could hear the footsteps closing in, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made his chest tighten. Finally, he burst through the side door and into the night. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Jumping inside, he locked the doors and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to start the engine. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The building stood silent and still, but in one of the broken windows, he saw a figure watching him. Ben never went back to Hollow Ridge Office Park. He uploaded the photos he had taken that night, but when he reviewed them, something was wrong. In every image, the shadows seemed to move, shifting slightly from frame to frame, and in the final photo, the one of the break room wall with the words "They never left," there was a face. It was his own. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Here's the story. The building stood at the edge of town like a forgotten relic, its windows shattered, walls scarred with graffiti, and vines crawling up its crumbling facade. Once a bustling textile mill, it had been abandoned for decades, whispered about in hushed tones among the locals. They called it Ashwood Mill, though no one remembered exactly why it had been shuttered so suddenly. Rumors of disappearances, strange lights, and unsettling sounds had kept even the boldest of trespassers at bay, all except for Ella. Ella was a photojournalist, always chasing the next great story or perfect shot. When she heard about Ashwood Mill, she knew she had to see it for herself. Local legends spoke of ghostly figures in the windows and machines turning on by themselves, but Ella wasn't one to believe in the supernatural. To her, the real story was the eerie beauty of decay, the history etched into the building's bones. She arrived just before dusk, her camera slung around her neck. The air felt colder near the building, and the surrounding trees seemed unnaturally still, their bare branches clawing at the sky. A chain-link fence encircled the property, but it had been cut open long ago by someone less cautious. Ella slipped through the gap, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. The mill loomed above her, its broken windows like empty eyes. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but shook it off. It was just an old building, she reminded herself. Nothing more. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rust. Long-forgotten machinery lay dormant, their iron frames coated in a fine layer of dust. Sunlight filtered through the broken windows, casting jagged patterns on the floor. Ella raised her camera and began to shoot, losing herself in the eerie beauty of the place. As she moved deeper into the building, the light began to fade. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Her breath puffed out in small clouds as she adjusted her settings for the dim light. It was then she heard it. A faint hum, low and mechanical, coming from somewhere deeper within the mill. She froze, her heart racing. It sounded like the hum of machinery, but that was impossible. The mill had been abandoned for decades. Taking a deep breath, she told herself it was probably just an animal or the wind finding its way through the structure, but the sound persisted, growing louder as she walked toward it. She followed the noise down a narrow corridor lined with rusted lockers and peeling paint. The hum was joined by the faintest sound of voices. Whispers, just barely audible. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling despite herself. The whispers stopped. Ella's footsteps faltered, but her curiosity pushed her forward. At the end of the corridor, she found a massive room filled with looms and weaving machines. The air was icy now, and the hum was louder, echoing off the walls. One of the machines at the far end of the room was vibrating slightly, its gears creaking as if it were trying to come to life. Her rational mind told her to leave, but her journalist instincts took over. She raised her camera and zoomed in on the machine, snapping photos as she approached. As she got closer, the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and frantic. She could make out fragmented words. Help, trapped, run. But they seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Is someone here? She called again, her voice shaky. The machine abruptly stopped vibrating and the room fell silent. Ella's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away. She turned to leave, but as she did, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. She spun around, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by the darkness. Its eyes, if they were eyes, seemed to glow faintly, like embers in a dying fire. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she raised her camera and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the room for a split second, and what she saw made her stomach drop. The figure wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy forms stood among the machines, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They were translucent, their bodies flickering like static on an old television. Ella stumbled back, nearly dropping her camera. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, overlapping into a cacophony of pleas and warnings. "Leave," one voice said clearly, cutting through the noise like a knife. She didn't need to be told twice. Ella turned and ran, her boots pounding against the floor as the whispers chased her. The corridors seemed longer now, twisting and turning in ways she didn't remember. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes on her, the air around her growing colder with each step. Finally, she burst through the front door and into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her chest heaving as she fumbled with her keys. Once inside, she locked the doors and stared at the mill, now silent and still. The shadows in the windows seemed to shift, but she couldn't be sure if it was her imagination or something else. Ella drove home in silence, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. That night, she reviewed the photos on her camera, hoping to find some logical explanation for what she had seen. Most of the images were unremarkable. Rusted machinery, broken windows, empty hallways. But when she reached the photo she had taken of the shadowy figure, her blood ran cold. The flash had captured it clearly. A tall, skeletal form with hollow, glowing eyes. Behind it, the room was filled with shadowy figures, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and despair. And then she noticed something else. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure that looked exactly like her. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the crumbling facade of the old Hawthorne textile mill. Everyone in town knew the stories. Whispers of shadows that moved when no one was there. the occasional sound of footsteps echoing through the vast empty halls. Some said it was haunted by the workers who had perished in the fire decades ago, their souls trapped in an endless loop of their final moments. Others dismissed it as superstition. But no one ever stayed inside long enough to prove either theory. Sarah wasn't one to believe in ghosts. As a junior journalist for the local paper, she was more interested in uncovering the real story behind the mill's closure. The official reports of the fire seemed vague, and no one wanted to talk about what really happened. She figured spending one night in the building might give her the angle she needed for a feature story, maybe even one good enough to get her out of this sleepy little town. She packed a flashlight, a notebook, a thermos of coffee, and her recorder. The mill loomed in front of her as she crossed the weed-choked parking lot, its shattered windows staring down like dead eyes. The air seemed heavier the closer she got. A strange stillness settled over the area, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The metal doors groaned in protest as she pushed them open, revealing a cavernous interior lined with rusted machinery. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating broken conveyor belts and piles of debris. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old blood. She shook off the chill crawling up her spine and stepped inside. "Nothing scary about an old building," she muttered, her voice sounding small against the vast emptiness. She set up her recorder on a nearby table and began walking through the space, narrating her observations. The mill had been abandoned for over 40 years, and nature was reclaiming its territory. Vines crept through cracks in the walls, and puddles of water reflected the faint light of her flashlight. Half an hour in, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed faintly, like something metallic striking wood. Her pulse quickened as she swung the flashlight around. Nothing. She walked toward the sound, her footsteps crunching on shattered glass. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, leading her to a staircase that descended into the basement. Just the wind, she told herself. But as she stood at the top of the stairs, the tapping stopped. Replacing it was a low, muffled whisper, like dozens of voices speaking at once, their words indistinguishable but urgent. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity and stubbornness kept her feet rooted. She descended the stairs, each creak of the steps echoing into the silence. At the bottom, her flashlight revealed rows of lockers, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. As she moved deeper into the basement, she noticed something strange on the walls. Charred handprints, as though someone had pressed their palms against the concrete while they burned. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to keep going. She found a small office at the far end of the basement. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the air felt colder than it should have been, even underground. On the desk sat an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age. She flipped it open, and her heart sank as she read the first entry. February 3rd, 1978. The fire was no accident. They locked us in here, all of us. We screamed, but no one came. They wanted to hide what we saw. The journal slipped from her hands as a loud bang echoed through the basement. Her flashlight flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the beam steadied, she saw them. Shadows stretching along the walls, too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. She backed out of the office, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows moved toward her, their elongated forms skittering across the walls and ceiling. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her ears with a cacophony of sorrow and rage. She bolted up the stairs, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The shadows followed, their forms growing more defined, long arms ending in claw-like hands, eyeless faces twisted in silent screams. She reached the main floor and sprinted toward the exit, but the metal doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the doors. Behind her, the whispers swelled into a roar. She turned, and for a moment she saw them clearly. Figures with charred skin and hollow eyes, their mouths moving in unison as they reached for her. "Help us," they whispered, their voices layering over one another. Her body froze, paralyzed by their gaze. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The doors creaked open and the night air rushed in. Sarah didn't look back as she fled the mill, though her recorder and notebook forgotten inside. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. When she finally looked in the rearview mirror, she swore she saw a shadow standing in the mill's doorway, watching her. She didn't write the article. She didn't even tell anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, she would hear that tapping sound again. Faint, rhythmic, coming from the corners of her room. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
The abandoned factory on the edge of town had been a source of fascination and fear for as long as anyone could remember. It was a hulking structure of crumbling brick and shattered glass, looming over a stretch of overgrown fields. Once a thriving steelworks, it had shut down abruptly 40 years ago, leaving behind only rumors of tragedy and inexplicable accidents. People claimed it was cursed. Some said it was haunted. Sophie didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but she did believe in great stories. As a budding journalist with a knack for digging into local legends, she saw the factory as the perfect subject for her next article. With her voice recorder, camera, and a flashlight, she planned to spend the night exploring the site. The air was crisp when she arrived, the moon casting pale light over the factory's jagged outline. Sophie parked her car near the rusted chain-link fence that surrounded the property and squeezed through a gap someone had cut long ago. Her boots crunched over gravel and weeds as she approached the main entrance, a massive set of iron doors that hung slightly ajar. The interior was suffocatingly dark, the weak beam of her flashlight barely penetrating the shadows. The smell of damp concrete and rust hung heavy in the air, mingled with a faint, acrid odor that made her wrinkle her nose. The first few rooms she entered were unremarkable. Offices stripped bare of furniture, a break room with shattered windows, and a long hallway with walls covered in graffiti. She took a few photos, her camera flash briefly illuminating the peeling paint and crumbling plaster. As she ventured deeper into the factory, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, colder, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere unseen. She checked her phone. No signal. Sophie brushed it off. It was an old building. Of course, it felt eerie. She pressed on, her curiosity outweighing her unease. The heart of the factory was a cavernous room filled with rusted machinery, their hulking forms like skeletons of extinct beasts. She paused to take more photos, adjusting her camera's settings to capture the play of light and shadow. That was when she heard it, a faint sound like the scrape of metal against metal. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty space. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the factory. Sophie hesitated, her instincts telling her to turn back, but her determination to uncover the truth pushed her forward. She followed the sound through a maze of corridors, her flashlight beam flickering over rust-streaked walls and broken pipes. The noise grew louder, more erratic, like something was being dragged across the floor. Finally, she reached a doorway that led to another large room. Her flashlight revealed a strange scene. A circular area of the floor was clear of debris, the concrete swept clean, as if someone had been here recently. In the center of the circle sat an old, rusted cart on wheels, its metal frame creaking as it rocked slightly back and forth. Sophie's mouth went dry. There was no wind, no reason for the cart to move. She stepped closer, her camera ready, when the cart suddenly lurched toward her, the wheels screeching against the floor. She stumbled back with a gasp, nearly dropping her flashlight. The cart stopped abruptly, as though held in place by some invisible force. Sophie's pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Okay," she muttered to herself. "Probably just gravity or something." She aimed her camera at the cart and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the room, and for a split second she saw a shadow, a figure standing in the corner, its form thin and distorted. Sophie spun around, but her flashlight revealed nothing. The corner was empty. Her hands shook as she reviewed the photo on her camera screen. The shadow was there, unmistakable, standing unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long. She swallowed hard, telling herself it had to be a trick of the light. Still, the oppressive feeling in the air grew stronger, pressing down on her like a weight. Sophie decided it was time to leave. She turned back toward the doorway, but as she stepped into the corridor, a cold breeze swept past her, carrying with it the faint sound of whispering. She stopped in her tracks, straining to hear. The whispers were faint, almost too quiet to understand, but they seemed to come from all around her. Go, leave, run. The words sent a chill down her spine. She broke into a jog, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she navigated the dark corridors. But the factory seemed different now, the layout unfamiliar, the walls closing in around her. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't find the way out. Every turn led to another identical hallway, the whispers growing louder with each step. Leave. You don't belong here. She stopped, leaning against a wall to catch her breath. Her heart pounded and her flashlight flickered, the light dimming as though the batteries were dying. Come on, she whispered, shaking the flashlight. A sudden crash echoed through the factory, like metal slamming against metal. Sophie screamed, the sound ricocheting off the walls. She turned and ran, not caring where she was going as long as it was away from whatever was making that noise. Finally, she stumbled into the first room she recognized, the main entrance. Relief washed over her as she saw the faint sliver of moonlight coming through the open doors. But as she stepped toward them, the air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The doors slammed shut with a force that shook the ground, plunging the room into darkness. Sophie screamed, pounding on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The roar of voices surrounded her, overlapping into a cacophony of anger and despair. You shouldn't have come. The flashlight slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor, its beam landing on a figure standing just a few feet away. It was the same shadow she'd seen in her photo, its tall, skeletal form swaying slightly as though it were breathing. Sophie backed away, her legs trembling, until her back hit the wall. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The figure stopped inches from her, its hollow eyes staring into hers. The room fell silent except for the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the presence vanished. The doors creaked open, and the moonlight spilled back into the room. Sophie didn't waste a second. She bolted through the doors and didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw the figure standing in the factory doorway, watching her. When she reviewed her photos later, every image was corrupted. Blurry streaks and dark smudges obscured the details. But one photo remained intact, the one of the cart in the circle. And in the corner of that image, the shadowy figure was staring directly at the camera. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The abandoned building at the edge of town had been a looming presence in Claire's life for years. She passed it every day on her commute, its crumbling facade and shattered windows like dark eyes watching her. It was a 4-story structure, once an orphanage, left to rot after a fire decades ago. Locals called it Hollow Pines, and stories about the place were plentiful. Children vanished there. Strange lights glowed in the windows at night, and some said that if you stepped inside, you might never come out. Claire didn't believe in ghosts, but she couldn't shake her curiosity. She was a freelance photographer, and Hollow Pines seemed like the perfect backdrop for her next project. That was what she told herself, anyway. Deep down, she wanted to prove the stories were just that, stories. One cold November afternoon, she finally decided to explore the building. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and her phone, Claire parked her car a block away and walked the short distance to Hollow Pines. The air grew colder as she approached, and the wind carried the faint scent of ash and decay. The wrought iron gates were rusted and slightly ajar, as though inviting her in. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the stone steps leading to the front door were cracked and uneven. The building itself was a hulking mass of brick and shadow, its scorched walls bearing the scars of the fire that had sealed its fate. Claire hesitated at the door, which hung off its hinges. The dim interior seemed to swallow the daylight. She took a deep breath, turned on her flashlight, and stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, but an oppressive stillness that pressed down on her ears. The air was thick, carrying a metallic tang that made her throat tighten. Her flashlight beam swept across the entryway, revealing a grand staircase, its banister warped and blackened. A chandelier lay in pieces on the floor, the shards of glass glinting like broken stars. Claire raised her camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the space, and for a moment she thought she saw movement at the edge of the frame. She lowered the camera and shone her flashlight in the direction, but there was nothing there, just a doorway leading deeper into the building. "Probably just a rat," she muttered, though her voice sounded hollow in the vast emptiness. She moved cautiously through the rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. The fire had ravaged everything: charred furniture, peeling wallpaper, and ceilings that sagged ominously. In one room, she found the remains of a nursery. Tiny, rusted cribs were scattered across the floor, their bars twisted like the branches of dead trees. A rocking horse sat in the corner, its paint faded and cracked. Claire felt a chill run down her spine as she snapped another photo. As she turned to leave the nursery, she heard a faint sound behind her, a soft creak, like the floorboards shifting under weight. She froze, her pulse quickening. Slowly, she turned around, her flashlight sweeping the room. It landed on the rocking horse. It was moving, back and forth, slowly, steadily. Claire's throat went dry. She took a step back, her mind racing for a logical explanation. The wind? Maybe? But there was no wind. The air was as still as death. She snapped a photo of the rocking horse, then bolted out of the room. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway as she tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread. She told herself it was her imagination, her nerves getting the better of her. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She reached the grand staircase and hesitated. Something about the second floor called to her, though she couldn't explain why. Against her better judgment, she started to climb. The stairs groaned under her weight, and she gripped the banister tightly, afraid it might collapse. The second floor was darker, the windows boarded up and the walls covered in graffiti. The temperature had dropped, and her breath came out in white puffs. She rubbed her arms, trying to stave off the chill as she explored the long hallway. Doors lined either side, some hanging open, others barely clinging to their hinges. One door at the far end was closed, and something about it made her uneasy. The wood was unmarked, free of the graffiti and scorch marks that marred the rest of the building. It looked new, out of place. She approached it slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. When she reached for the handle, the cold metal burned against her skin. She yanked her hand back, staring at the door in disbelief. Before she could decide what to do, the handle turned on its own. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in faint, flickering light. Claire stepped inside, her heart pounding. The room was pristine, untouched by fire or time. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and shelves lined with toys and books filled the space. A small bed sat in the corner, its sheets neatly tucked in. It was as if the fire had never reached this room. But the most unsettling thing was the figure sitting on the bed. A child. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. He wore old-fashioned clothes, his white shirt and suspenders immaculate. His hair was dark, and his eyes were black. No whites, no pupils, just endless, empty black. Claire gasped, stumbling backward. The boy tilted his head as if studying her. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice echoing strangely. Claire couldn't speak. She couldn't move. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said, his smile fading. "They don't like visitors." Who doesn't like visitors?" Claire finally managed to whisper. The boy's expression darkened, and the light in the room flickered violently. "You need to leave," he said, his voice rising. "They're coming." Before Claire could respond, the boy vanished. The room around her flickered like a dying light bulb, and suddenly it wasn't pristine anymore. The walls were blackened, the shelves empty, and the bed reduced to a pile of ash. A loud crash echoed from somewhere below, followed by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Claire bolted out of the room, her flashlight beam swinging wildly as she ran. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows closing in around her. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made her blood run cold. She reached the staircase and nearly tripped in her haste to descend. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the building itself were alive and trying to hold her back. She could hear the footsteps right behind her, impossibly close, but she didn't dare look back. Finally, she burst through the front door and into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she started the engine and sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The building loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but in one of the broken windows, she saw a figure watching her. It was the boy. He was smiling. Claire never returned to Hollow Pines. She developed the photos she had taken that day, but every image from the second floor was distorted. Shadows filled the frames, twisting and writhing like living things. And in the corner of each photo was the boy, his black eyes staring straight at her. Story the end.